Good morning. My name is Paul Pass. I'm the executive director of the Japan America Society of Dallas Fort Worth. And again, Ohayo gozaimasu, konnichiwa. Welcome to our program, the U.S. Japan Space Partnership, Fostering Collaboration on Earth and Beyond. Space is currently a popular topic in the news, and there are presently 14 humans orbiting our planet, which is a new record for the number of people in space at the same time. We are also excited because over 200 of you have registered for our conversation on the vibrant and indispensable U.S. Japan alliance. Thank you to our event partners, the Japan America Society of Alabama, the Sun and Star Program on Japan and East Asia at the SMU Tower Center on Public Policy and International Affairs, and the World Affairs Council of Dallas Fort Worth. Please note that this program is being recorded, and we plan to upload to the Japan America Society Dallas Fort Worth YouTube channel likely by the end of this week. If you have any trouble hearing our speakers, please write in the chat box that's on the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions related to the content of our event, please share in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will address audience questions in approximately 45 minutes from now. I would now like to welcome our partners to give a brief welcome. So please, I would like to invite the Japan American Society of Alabama.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Teresa Wise. I'm with JASA, the Japan America Society of Alabama, and I'm on the executive committee. Our executive director was unable to join tonight, but I'm very happy to be here in her place. Like most Japan America societies, we support a very robust set of Japanese companies that are based in Alabama. Our office is in Birmingham, Alabama. And of course, we also support cultural and educational exchanges between the US and Japan. I also want to say that I'm extremely happy to be here and to partner and to listen to this presentation this evening because I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, literally in the shadow of NASA, feeling the Saturn V occasionally shake the house. So again, I'm very happy to be here and to partner with you, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Now I'd like to welcome SMU Tower Center.
Welcome. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi, Director of SMU Tower Center Sun Star Program on Japan and East Asia. U.S. Japan alliance is more important than ever before. And space is the most important issue, one of the most important issues for U.S. Japan cooperation. Tower Center is organizing the webinars on that will have on the issues that have long-term implications on U.S. Japan relations. It will start with this semester. It will start with October 7th webinar by Dr. Yves Tiverdian of University of British Columbia, who will talk about East Asian COVID paradox. We'll have more events on the Tower Center website. Today, the space, this is a very important issue, and welcome and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Hiroki. Now I'd like to welcome the World Affairs Council of Dallas Fort Worth.
Thank you so much. What an exciting topic. Good evening, everyone. Ohayo gozaimasu. My name is Liz Brailsford. I'm President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas Fort Worth. So we are in town with the Japan America Society of Dallas Fort Worth, and we convene speaker programs. We do education programs. We work with the State Department on incoming international visitors, and we work with the City of Dallas on their protocol services for incoming dignitaries and governments. And I am thrilled to be here. Thank you to Paul Pass and his team at the Japan America Society. We're so happy to be partnering with you. We hold programs on Japan. We partner with Japanese companies here that are have headquarters in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we're just thrilled to be doing this. Also, I have a little bit of a special connection to Japan. I started my career in Japan in Niigata-ken, working for the JET program, and was there for a little over 3 years. It irrevocably changed my life. I know that for a fact. And that's why I'm standing here in front of you right now, well, virtually. But in any case, I'll also be leading a program or a trip to Japan next March. If you'd like to check out any of our international programming, this trip to Japan I'll be leading, please check out our website at dfwworld.org. We'd love to have you join us for some of our events and in Japan in March. Paul, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Teresa, Hiroki, and Liz. I would now like to welcome Tomoko Hosaka Muleni, who will be our moderator for the program. She is the Vice President at the Asia Group, and she will give some remarks and introduce our speakers. Tomoko, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome such a distinguished lineup of speakers for tonight's program, the U.S. Japan Space Partnership, Fostering Collaboration on Earth and Beyond. As Paul mentioned, my name is Tomoko Hosaka Muleni. I'm Vice President at the Asia Group, which is a strategic consultancy based here in Washington, D.C. And in my previous life, not too long ago, I was a business and technology journalist for the Associated Press, both here in D.C. and in Tokyo. I want to first really thank our audience for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us from multiple time zones. We've had a tremendous response and really excited by your enthusiasm for this program. We expect this to be a robust, dynamic conversation and encourage you to send us your questions. I'll briefly go over the format for this evening. We're going to start with brief remarks from each of our speakers. Then we will have a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we will turn to questions from you all. So if you do have questions, please write them in the Q&A here on Zoom. I believe it's on the bottom, and we will try to get through as many as we can. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished panel, whose voices represent the U.S. and Japan, public sector, and private sector. First, we have Masami Onoda, who is currently director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, or more commonly known as JAXA for short. She will speak to us about U.S.-Japan government space collaboration. And the next we'll have Mr. Michael Fletcher, who is president of MFJ Consulting, which is a firm that he started after retiring from a long career at NASA. During the span of his 30-year career at NASA, Mr. Fletcher served as chief engineer, program manager, and researcher, and he will speak to us about U.S.-Japan collaboration in the U.S. private sector. Our third speaker is Masayasu Ishida, who is co-founder and CEO of the Space Tide Foundation, which is a Tokyo-based nonprofit organization founded in 2016 to foster the development and expansion of the space business ecosystem. He's also a key member of several of the government's space-related committees, including the Committee on National Space Policy. Ishida-san will be discussing U.S.-Japan collaboration in the Japanese private sector. And last but not least, we will hear from Sadia Pekkanen, who is the Job and Gertrude Tamaki Endowed Professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. She is also the founding co-director of the Space Policy and Research Center at the University of Washington. She will speak to us about the role of space in the U.S.-Japan Security and Defense Alliance. So Onoda-san, the floor is yours. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Tomoko-san, for the kind introduction. My name is Masami Onoda, Director of JAXA Washington, D.C. office. We, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, are the implementing agency for Japan's space program. JAXA is working on various areas of space activities, including rocket and satellites, human space activities, space and earth science, including efforts to tackle climate change, space exploration, and aeronautics. Japan has more than 60 years of history in space development, and the United States has always been the closest partner. A symbolic collaboration is the International Space Station, or ISS. The picture in the slide in the background here is the ISS with the Japanese module called Kibo, where astronauts conduct science experiments leveraging the unique environment in space. Next slide, please. So space was one of the major topics that was discussed at almost every Japan-US heads of state meeting. But one that really set the scene was in May 2019, where the leaders of the two countries agreed to strengthen the cooperation in security, exploration, industry, and moon exploration. Here are some examples. Collaboration in space situational awareness to track and monitor spacecrafts and debris for a safer and sustainable space environment. Sample exchange, contributions in exploration missions, and participation of JAXA's astronauts in human spaceflight in cooperation with commercial partners, such as SpaceX's Crew Dragon mission. Next slide, please. Japan is also joining NASA's Artemis program to go to the moon sustainably and then onto Mars. The government of Japan and NASA made a joint declaration for cooperation in lunar exploration in July 2020, we called it JEDI, and then finalized an agreement on the collaboration for the Gateway program in December 2020. Gateway, as you can see in this slide, is a spacecraft that is going to orbit around the moon. And Japan is planning to contribute batteries for the habitation and logistics outpost called HALO and environmental control and life support system for the International Habitation Module. Japan is also one of the 12 countries that have signed what is called the Artemis Accords, a common set of principles to govern civil exploration and use of outer space. So that was a very quick overview of our aspirational space program. I hope I was able to provide understanding on how closely Japan and the US have been working together in space. I will stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Onoda-san. Mr. Fletcher, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Tomoko-san, for that introduction. And if I could have the first slide, we'll go ahead and get started. I think Masami really set the stage for the importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship in space, particularly on the civil side. And I want to talk about a few factors that are influencing what's happening on the commercial side, particularly as we look from the U.S. and towards Japan. So thank you, Paul. If you could go to the next slide. So I have just one slide here, but I want to make just briefly 3 points that are really influencing kind of the global situation that we're seeing, and specifically some of the things that are happening with the US and Japan. So first, overall, despite COVID, the space sector has really seen some impressive growth. Overall, the sector was growing by about 4.5% last year, and that was really led by the commercial sector. The civil side, the government side was more or less flat. A big reason for this is that launch costs have been coming down, and as launch costs come down, that's really enabling some new markets to emerge. This is bringing investors into the marketplace, and that's really fueling growth, particularly in the startup market. And we're seeing a lot of that activity in LEO, but at all orbital regimes. A few examples of that include space tourism. There was, of course, big news just yesterday about a SpaceX private crew. Orbital debris and orbital servicing is another area. Commercial remote sensing is something that's growing tremendously right now, as well as telecommunications and broadband services. Now, the second point I want to make is what's happening in the civil sector, and this is true particularly at NASA, but I think also at JAXA as well, and that is that NASA is evolving from an entity where they used federal dollars to support the civil space program, and they were really the customer in space, to one now where NASA supports a commercial space marketplace that is being one of many customers. So in that capacity, NASA is really buying more contracted servicing or services instead of designing their own and buying those systems for themselves. And a couple of fairly common examples that have been cited are the Commercial Lunar Payload Services, or the CLPS contract, and the Commercial Crew Program, which has launched NASA astronauts to the ISS, and that has happened a couple of times now. Now, the third and final point I want to make before I get off the stage here is that with this global growth, we're seeing a lot more startups in Japan coming to the United States and entering into the U.S. Market. We're also seeing U.S. companies going to Japan. A couple of startup examples of startup companies that have come from Japan include iSpace and Astroscale, which both fairly recently opened offices in Denver that they're doing to support their growing U.S. operations and expand opportunity to work with not only the U.S. government, but other commercial customers as well. So this is really setting the stage for an advancement and an opportunity on the commercial side for greater U.S. and Japan collaboration in the space sector. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to the questions and the discussions that we have coming up. Thanks, Tomoko.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Ishida-san, you're up next.
Yes, thank you, Tomoko-san, for the kind introduction. Good evening, everyone, and ohayo gozaimasu. My name is Masayasu Ishida, CEO of Space Tide Foundation, hosting one of the biggest commercial space business conference in Asia. I'm also a member of Japan's National Space Policy Committee. So I'm pleased to be here, and as my opening remarks, I'd like to share the overview of Japan's commercial space industry ecosystem. So could you share the slide page 1? Yep, thank you. So as Michael mentioned, commercial space activities is evolving rapidly. So Japan too, we have seen 50 years of space development led by National Space Agency, JAXA. But recently, our interest in commercial space in both the public and the private sector is increasing. We can see new industrial ecosystem development for commercial space industry. A variety of startups and non-space industry players step into the various market segments. There are about 50 space startups that engage in a wide range of space business, and also more than 100 large corporations from various terrestrial industry have begun to invest in the space industry. Japanese government has been also playing a key role in developing the space industry ecosystem. Japanese government set a goal of the doubling size of the domestic space market by the early 2030s and has implementing a variety of measures to encourage the space activities in the private sector. Next slide, please. Thank you. So regarding the U.S. Japan collaboration, I would say the U.S. is a strategic partner, not only for the Japanese government, but also the Japan's private sectors. I think the U.S. Japan collaboration in private sector is accelerating as the commercial space activities is gaining momentum. So historically, space industry has been conducted on country and regional basis. However, commercial space business, industry ecosystem for commercial space business is becoming more diversified and international, with the number of stakeholders is increasing rapidly. So under such circumstances, I'd say cross-border alliance, joint ventures, and also merger and acquisition will be extremely important for the sustainable growth of the private space company. So the US and the Japan private company can collaborate for the future growth. So I'd like to talk more about the area of collaboration in the private sector in the free discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ishida-san. That was very interesting. Ms. Pekanen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And can you all hear me okay, Tomoko? Great. So thank you, first of all, to the sponsors for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. If you will just very briefly permit me, at the University of Washington, My work is on the international politics of space security as well as Japan. And I am recently just now co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Space Security, and I've just finished co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Japanese Politics. So I have a foot in both camps. And in addition to that, I co-chair the U.S. Japan Space Forum, which runs under the auspices of the Mansfield Foundation. Now, what I want to do for today is to use my ongoing work to sort of offer some opening remarks that link to some of the thematic issues that you have heard from the other panelists. And I'm particularly interested in the role of alliances related to space and of trying to understand their role from the point of view of strategy and policy. A key point that I want to make is that rivalries on Earth are moving to become rivalries in space. And so too, alliances on Earth may become alliances in space, not least among them the U.S.-Japan alliance. Today, what I see is a central challenge in the space domain in a world returned to great power competition. That is the challenge of building safe, secure, and reliable practices in and through space for all public and private stakeholders around the world. I believe the U.S.-Japan alliance has an important role to play in helping to bring about such practices. The two allies have, of course, been working to enhance their space security cooperation over the past 2 decades in ways big and small. And today, I think there are at least 3 other common points of interest that bode well for reinforcing their space alliance going forward. Let me just touch upon these briefly, and then we can come back to some of them in the conversation. First, I would say that both the US and Japan share increasingly a common understanding of the natural, accidental, and deliberate threats against space assets and the ways in which these assets underwrite their own economic and military security. And this understanding has been built on the dangers and risks posed by orbital debris. Second, I would say that building on that foundational understanding, they share a common interest in building out and collaborating on space situational awareness, SSA, or what is now, I think, also called space domain awareness. That is a better and more accessible map of what is going on in space to mitigate risks such as from orbital debris and other kinds of dangers. They have, of course, an SSA agreement from 2013, but today, as Japan advances its own space defense capabilities, including SSA, the two allies are also looking to harness commercially driven technology platforms across borders to ensure that we have the technical building block to support peaceful practices in space. And there's a recent agreement, for example, between North Star Earth and Space in Montreal, Canada, and Japan Space Imaging that gives us a sense of how commercial SSA can also help in building out these things. And finally, I would say that a third commonality of interest in both countries is that they have space forces. The US has a space force, and as is well known, Japan has stood up its own space operations squadron. And I think that these can also play a role in a more comprehensive approach to SSA, advancing jointness on the non-technical side, such as human expertise and training. In addition, they can aid in strategic planning to coordinate understanding and responses at the national, regional, and multilateral levels, including, for example, Quad. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I hope this gives you some sense of the way that we're thinking about space defense collaboration between the two allies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful opening, and we look forward to hearing more from you later. So I wanted to maybe start off, before we get into kind of policy and business, wanted to have the audience get to know all of you and your stories a little bit better. Millions were inspired by President John F. Kennedy's moonshot speech 6 decades ago, and perhaps a new generation will be inspired by the private space travel moguls of the 21st century. This is a question directed to all of you. What inspired you to work in space? Was there a specific event, or if you could kind of tell us a little bit about how you fell into this line of work? I think our audience would find it really interesting. So whoever wants to start. Onoda-san, why don't you start?
Okay, I didn't know if in this session we were all supposed to turn on our cameras, maybe, but yeah.
Why don't you all turn on your cameras? Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So, well, since I was the first one to turn on my camera, I get thanks. Yeah, so what inspired me to work in space? Great question. I was born in Massachusetts. That happens to be the reason my name is Masami, Masa from Massachusetts. So yeah, and I had kind of lived between two countries, and so international was kind of the theme of my life. But then you start to think about international relations, and kind of sometimes you do not know which to choose, and there are different interests, and it's difficult. And when I met with the work in space, I just felt, oh, now I'm liberated, and I can work globally. I can work even cosmically. Well, still, as we are discussing today, we see that even more of the bilateral balances are more prominent in, of course, when we work in space, but that was what inspired me first to work in space.
I guess maybe we just follow the order in which we started. That might be easy. So I'll give you a little bit of my background. I was thinking about this question, and as long as I can remember, I've had an interest in aerospace. I mean, literally when I was 4 years old, just staring at airplanes in the sky and wondering how they stood up or stayed in the air. So my passion actually started with aviation, and I spent a fair amount of my career working in aviation. But I turned to space as I think that space has become a really exciting and dynamic place. And Ishida-san talked a little bit about the expanding global network and the fact that there are so many new companies and non-traditional companies that are getting into the market. We see exciting things like coming from SpaceX or Blue Origin almost every day. That I just find that quite captivating, and so it's really drawn me in, and I'm happy and excited to be a part of that. And so at NASA I had a wonderful opportunity and a great career to be a part of the civil side, and I'm very excited to be a part of the commercial side right now as it goes forward, because I think it's a tremendous amount of growth and opportunity going forward.
Yeah, so for me, I was inspired by our Google Lunar X Prize. So do you know the Google Lunar X Prize? It was a $30 million prize contest to send a robotic rover to the surface of the moon. So it's a long history. When I was in elementary school, so I read about the Greek mythology and became interested in stars. So that was my first encounter with the space. But unfortunately, I didn't get involved in the space activities in my 20s. However, at the age of 29, I decided to volunteer in the space startups. So I joined Team Hactor. It's a Google Lunar X Prize operated Japanese space startup, iSpace. So in 2013, I went to Chile, South America, to join an X Prize Team Summit. So I spent 2 days or 3 days with a spirited entrepreneur around the globe. It was my first experience to meet with a space startup around the world. That experience inspired me. Yeah. And when I came back to Japan, I decided to start working in the space industry. Yeah, that's my story.
Gosh, those are such amazing and interesting stories. My story is more also a process. I think I used to have a picture as a child. This is a picture of Earthrise. This is a very iconic picture that is taken by Bill Anders and it is the first picture that we see Earth from space in some ways. And my father used to work for the United Nations. And as a child, I carried that picture with me all over the world. I don't quite know what happened to that picture, but that's the kind of image that I have of space. And I think that is both an important vision to work towards, and just one of those classic things that inspired me to sort of begin thinking a little bit more coherently about space. So that's my story.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. Wanted to maybe start off by kind of asking a question to perhaps to Onoda-san and Ms. Pekkanen. Broadly speaking, what would you say are the goals of both the U.S. and Japanese governments, respectively, in kind of today's bilateral and multilateral space collaboration? Onoda-san, if you want to start off, that'd be great.
Yeah, it was part of my opening statements that well, the leaders of two countries have agreed in areas specifically in security, exploration, industry. And so those also coincide with the goals of the Japanese national space policy. So I guess these are broadly the focus areas as of now, and exactly actually the focus of our webinar today, I suppose. Everything we do between U.S., Japan, we really want to support those goals, and JAXA is here to support that from the science and technology and development side.
Yeah. So I will just, let me see. Yeah, so I will just follow from there and echo a little bit what Masami has put on the table. I think that Japan and the US are among the top space powers in the world, technically speaking. And the way that they behave in space and with respect to space is extremely important. So like Masami, I think I also said this in my opening statement, I think that the fundamental issue for both of them in a world that's returned to great power competition is really to think about how do we build safe, secure, and reliable practices in and through space so that our civilian, commercial, and security operations can continue. And this is not just true for the US and Japan. I think that this is important for any power, whether established or emerging, that has an interest in becoming a space stakeholder. So that's what I would say is really the issue.
Great. Let me kind of a related question to Ishida-san. I know that you're involved in kind of space policy at the national level. I know that last year Japan revised its basic space policy. Wanted to see if you could speak about some of the top changes that were made and some of the highlights from that that are especially prominent in your mind when it comes to U.S.-Japan space collaboration and the direction of the country.
Yeah, I think for the Japanese government, strategic cooperation with the U.S. government is extremely important. So Japan has a basic plan on space policy, which defines a national space development strategy. So this plan has been revised every 4 to 5 years. So last year we had a 4th revision. So I was involved in the discussion as a member of the Committee on National Space Policy. And through the discussion, strategic partnership was emphasized as a basic principle of Japan's space policy. So, various companies and countries are stepping into the space industry at an accelerated recently. A number of stakeholders is increasing rapidly as well. So I think that it's becoming more difficult for the space sector to harmonize our activities for the sustainable use of the space in the future. So I think the Japanese government and also U.S. government should collaborate to lead the international community and to promote the international framework principle and standard in the future.
That's great. Mr. Fletcher, could you talk a little bit more about, in greater detail, kind of, what are the areas, do you think the American and Japanese private sector space industry, what are the most promising areas? You mentioned a few companies that you see, have really, stand out. Could you talk a little bit more in depth of what areas are really places that you're watching?
Yeah, I think that Saudi mentioned this too, but orbital debris and on-orbit servicing has really been much more active in Japan. And that is something that has become much of greater importance globally. And you hear this quite a bit. I think, and Masami may correct me here, but I think it was even brought up at the G7 not too long ago. And it is recognized as something that is is something that needs to be addressed. And I think that's one area in particular. I think that in Japan, robotics is another area which there's a lot of good technology and capability. And I think that there's a movement towards more automation in space, and the implementation of machine learning and AI specifically to because we're generating so much data, particularly for remote sensing. And so I think that's another area where there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. And there's a few others. Material science is another one as well that seems sort of pedestrian, but that's really critical when it comes to design of structure and whatnot. So I think those three in particular come to mind. But there's a lot of different opportunities that exist and that are really growing as space in the commercial sector grows beyond just a traditional sort of rockets and spaceships and becomes more goods, services, and commodities. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, particularly in the very near future, because there are a substantial number of launches that are planned in the next couple of years. And I think we're going to see a dramatic change in internet service, telecommunication, weather and data and remote sensing information and things like that.
Excellent. What about research? This is a question posed to all of you. What is the next and most exciting, frontier of space research, and why would that be important for our life here on planet Earth? Anybody who wants to tackle that? Maybe Onoda-san, you can start.
Yeah, well, there are so many interesting and inspiring frontiers, but here I would just choose Moon and Mars, because I've been talking about this since the outset. So Moon and Mars, onto Mars, and especially to have our astronauts human presence there, and not just to go, but to stay this time, and to conduct, of course, those research for people to be able to stay and to be able to go on sustainably to Mars and hopefully beyond in the future. So that is really one area that excites, I think, everybody. And in those lines, yeah, I'm really proud to say that we will, after many years, be calling for a new batch of astronauts very soon, and I want everybody to watch out for that and stay tuned. And so there are very, very exciting frontiers in front of us.
Yeah. I'll follow on something. So Masami has taken us off planet. Let me also suggest that at least one exciting frontier that we see is how much of our life around us, both in established and emerging countries, human activities can be shaped by the amount of data that we're actually getting from outer space because of remote sensing, because of Earth observation satellites. And in addition, we have a lot of communications satellites in low Earth orbit also going into place. So how that affects the digital divide and whether it helps us to connect areas of the world, both in terms of understanding what's going on there and also in terms of communications, is something that is around us. So very often, I think we have this idea that whatever is happening in outer space is, something that's happening off planet. I would say that the most immediate thing that is important is that we try to understand also how it's affecting our understanding of human activities around us. And so a lot of the frontiers that you heard about today in terms of mega constellations, communication or, remote sensing or Earth observation, those also will affect, how we think about and build better programs for people around the world. Great. Go ahead.
Yeah, regarding the space research, so I would suggest that research on the upper atmosphere using the satellite will become more important in the future. Also, it's not a pure space research. However, while it's believed that the upper atmosphere between the 50 kilometer to 300 kilometer above the ground is strongly affected by the climate change, right? the actual situation has not yet been clarified because it has been difficult to make actual measurement. However, so JAXA launched a super low altitude test satellite, we call SLATS, to make a long-term measurement of atomic oxygen, the main component at the altitude of 200 kilometers to 300 kilometers. So this data is expected to contribute to improving the accuracy of atmospheric data and increasing our understanding of the physical phenomena related to the climate change. I think that it's also an area of future collaboration with regard to space research.
I'll add a couple of topics. So one of the things that we're seeing happening right now is a lot of growth towards software-defined features and functionalities in space. And so as an example, you might have standard satellite buses that go up and they become programmed for specific functions, whether it's telecommunications and certain frequency bands or whatnot. And I think that's very likely. If you think about aviation, is my boss at NASA used to say, when you talk about Boeing, if you look at 3 generations of Boeing aircraft, the amount of software that was on those airplanes increased substantially. It went from 400,000 lines of code to 4 million lines of code to 14 million lines of code. In fact, some cars on the road today have 100 million lines of code. So my boss used to say, is Boeing an airplane company or a software company? And I think we're going to see the same kinds of things happen in space, because being able to define the features that you want on the vehicles in space it builds in a lot of flexibility. So I think software in general, software applications, machine learning, artificial intelligence applied to remote sensing and image analysis is really taking off. And I think that's an area. It's sort of a little bit more thinking in terms of LEO, not like Masami said, talking about deep space and lunar, which also has a lot of interesting technology opportunities too, like in situ manufacturing and things like that. So there's a whole host of things that make it really interesting looking forward. And I think a lot of opportunity for both U.S. companies, Japanese companies, and JAXA and NASA, of course, as well, to be contributing to those missions, in addition to supporting the security posture that I think is also critical to the strategic interests of the nations.
And if I could add something to that, I think that we mentioned this, I think perhaps all the panelists, and certainly I know Masami did, is space situational awareness, which will require awareness all the way from the Earth to what is happening in low Earth orbit, as well as deep space. So how we sort of build out the infrastructure that deals with that, both on the hardware and software side, how we train people, how we educate and train people to sort of, take advantage of that, and then how we build strategic coordination in terms of responding to all kinds of threats that are there naturally or deliberate or accidental in space, I think is probably the biggest and important business opportunity staring people in the face. So I would say that is an avenue that I think from a business perspective, we really do have to keep an eye on.
Thanks very much. I wanted to talk about challenges a little bit. Maybe throw this question to Mr. Fletcher. You worked at NASA for more than 30 years, and you spent time working on partnerships. What are some of the challenges or obstacles that you had to contend with when working with Japanese industrial partners?
Right. So I think that the posture is kind of, there's a legacy posture within the agency, I'll say, that hasn't really kept pace with the global developments that Ishida-san was talking about, for example, in overall, but specifically in the commercial sector. And NASA really supports its domestic industrial partners. And so when we saw the opportunity of trying to collaborate with industrial partners, it's very difficult to do that. The best way to go forward and do that, and I think this is probably also true for U.S. companies going to work in Japan, but is to find a domestic partner to work with. There are sort of unique opportunities for Japanese companies to work with NASA, for example, specifically, but those tend to be very specific science missions with no commercial application, or in cases where the technology maybe only exists within that particular company. But in a more general sense, partnering with the U.S. company is a really good means to work with NASA and engage with NASA. And an example of that is actually through the CLIPS program that I mentioned earlier. iSpace did partner with Draper Labs and was able to win as a member of that team, where Draper was the lead, and won a contract with NASA under CLIPS. So I think that's an effective way, but I would like to see it change. I think it's time to see that change. And NASA, I know, has tried to move a little bit in that direction, but I think that the fact that space is a global entity is really, it sort of really needs to push us in that direction.
Great. And Ishida-san, if you could respond from the Japanese side, what are the challenges that Japanese companies face in collaborating with the US?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the great question. So I agree with Michael's comment. So I think that there are several reasons for the Japanese company to collaborate with the US community. So I think the first is to capture US demand. The US space market is the largest market in the world. Company from various countries, not only Japan, have been entering into the US market. However, it's a bit challenging for the foreign country to capture local demand. So Japanese company are trying to hire local talent and also set up a local branch there and improve their business model to fit with the US market. So some Japanese company like Astrosphere and iSpace, as Michael mentioned, has been implemented this approach in the US market. So that's a challenge for the Japanese company, I think.
Okay, great. We have a number of audience questions, so I want to see if we can turn to some of those. Let's see. Oh, this is one that I was going to ask. Ms. Pekkanen, you had mentioned, rivalries on Earth are becoming rivalries in space. What are some of the risks and challenges you anticipate with those rivals in space?
Yeah. So I think that the thing we need to think about as, alliances are sort of dividing around us is what that means for stability in the space domain. And the issue is, how do we stop any kind of a shooting war from actually taking place in space? So I think regardless of whether we see this bipolar space alliance structure going into place, what is it that we can do? Can all parties agree on in terms of what is safe, secure, and reliable practices in space? So I don't think this is, it doesn't take much to say that this is an extremely hazardous environment already, and then compounded with the challenges of all kinds of arms races and weaponization in outer space. This does not bode well for any kind of civilian and commercial prospects going forward. So how do we all come to the table and sort of have stable platforms that allow us to build on that understanding? That's the challenge that I see. I think everybody can see what the problems are. The issue is, through what platforms can we actually advance a common understanding? How do we do that? I think that's where we are. I think that also, incidentally, is an extraordinarily important frontier for research. How do we do that? It's a practical problem, and which is unusual for academics, of course, but I think that is hugely important. So that's what I would put on the table for us to consider.
Yeah, Onoda-san, I'm curious to see if you have thoughts about that, about the rivalries in space that JAXA anticipates and the challenges that
Yes.
Japan foresees.
Mm-hmm. No, the point that Sadia mentioned, that it is an extremely academic, but at the same time extremely practical question. I heard with much interest, because I would also, as a practitioner, it's a problem that we face every day. I mentioned Artemis Accords. it could be seen as, well, Artemis Accords alone has so many facets. So one of the lights you can shed is that a light, I would say, of alliances, rivalries, and who do you want to work with, so to say, when we are going to the moon and beyond, and who's going to work with us. And if you want to work with us, we shall have rules and principles. And why don't we agree on those that we know at the moment was sort of the idea behind the Artemis Accords. And this is, when we said we signed this, it sounds very legal and formal, but this was really a political declaration at the time. And that's an important point too. So I guess the point I'm making is we are very much in the initial step and defining such rules and principles. And it's very important that we work on this together. And I think we have much room for creativity. We don't have to just extend what we're doing on Earth. And so working with academia, with of course, the commercial partners, we got to think about this very seriously and start to work. Well, we have started the work with Artemis Accords, and we want to further build on that.
Great, thank you. We have a question, let's see, about the Elon Musk's SpaceX mission to grow the tourism market. Want to get all of your thoughts on that. Are you bullish on that? Do you think the company will continue to grow and be profitable? Do you think others will jump in? Yeah, what do you think about space tourism?
I'll start. I think that it's, I would describe it as kind of a boutique. You know, it's extremely expensive. Space is much riskier than people really, I think, believe. You know, there on Richard Branson's flight, there was an issue that ultimately resulted in them getting grounded because of the way they flew the envelope. But it's, you know, there's a lot of systems that can fail, and they generally, when they fail, things, you know, it ends up very badly. So I just think that we're still quite a ways off from space tourism overall. I think that more, you know, likely we're going to see a much more, you know, we're going to continue to see the kind of commercial expansion outside of tourism that's going to drive the market. And ultimately, if the prices are down, come down to the point where it becomes a little bit more affordable, and it becomes more, it just becomes more stable. I guess I'll say it's safe. I think then you'll see the tourism market come in. But you know, you're always going to have people with a lot of dollars and you know, a lot of time on their hands to want to go off and do these kinds of things. So that's my thought.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, Ishida-san.
Can I add a comment? So first, big congratulations to the U.S. panelists and the participants on the successful launch of a SpaceX inspiration for yesterday. So that's amazing. So I think that it's a new era of commercial human space flight. So I think that to expand the horizon of the space industry and to accelerate the collaboration between the US and Japan, the key is to create a new demand. So I mean, the space industry historically is mainly driven by the governmental demand, public demand. And the governmental agency will continue to be an important client for the private sector. However, most of the governmental program has been carried out on country and regional basis, right? So I think the commercial space business is becoming more international, right? So in addition to public demand, I think the private demand will be the key driver for the growth of the commercial space activities in the future. So one potential area might be business to business. It means the utilization of satellite data, something like that. And on the other hand, I think the business to consumer will expand in the future. Before, there was no consumer demand in the space industry. However, in the year of 2025, commercialization of a human space flight has just begun, right? In human space flight, in the future, point-to-point transportation service will create new consumer demand. I believe the new demand from the private sector will be the key to accelerate the collaboration between the US and Japan community. That's my opinion.
That's great. Anybody else have thoughts on space tourism? No. Okay, let's move on to, we have somebody who wants to know a little bit more about the orbital debris problem. What is the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? If somebody could kind of talk a little bit more about the issue, that would be helpful.
Well, I'll start, but I think that, you know, it's an issue for all of us, and each, you know, each of us has, I think, pointed it out in a slightly different respect. But the problem is that there are a lot of launches that are being planned, and with each launch, you know, there is material that gets deposited in space, and that material is going. The relative velocities of those objects is extremely high. And if they hit each other, and occasionally this has happened in the past, where you have a conjunction, it can generate a tremendous amount of debris. And then, you know, you can envision a scenario where you generate more and more debris out of more and more collisions. And then it becomes basically uninhabitable. You know, you really can't pass through it. And so that's the ultimate, you know, worst case scenario. There are companies like Astroscale is one that is committed to, this is a Japanese company that is committed to providing technology that can remove material from space, you know, to go up and actively remove that. But there are challenges with this because, you know, how do you enforce somebody to do this when there are no real rules of the road, if you will? You know, it's all about being a good steward for space. It's collectively in our best interest to do it. But if it costs me a little bit of extra money, am I actually going to do it when I don't have to worry about it so much today, maybe tomorrow? So there are some real significant challenges to making that that market idea work, but it's really essential that we get it to work in some way. And maybe Saudia, you can talk a little bit more about some of these policies, or you know, the international pressure that kind of goes with this, that we're trying to really, I think, bring forward to help to sort of stimulate this opportunity.
Yeah, so I think, Michael, you described it great. I don't think that there's much left to try. It's really as if something goes out in space, you may not have your GPS, you may not get your communication, you may not get your broadcasting, we will not get geospatial intelligence. And if you think that those things are important, let us think more carefully about what it would take to prevent these kinds of accidents and the challenges that exist in space. The issue here is, of course, a lot of the infrastructure is old. There are, you know, so sometimes you have satellites that may be imploding, sometimes they're colliding, sometimes they're deliberately targeted. So the issue, given all these sort of commercial and military trends, is how do you build a system in which you know, people can sort of agree. So I think that we all have said today that we're really at the beginning stages, but we also need to try to act together in terms of collaboration. And this is one area that I think the US and Japan alliance can be very pivotal on. It's trying to think hard about really what it takes to build secure, stable, and you know, peaceful practices in outer space. There is now, we of course have IADC guidelines. We have a good understanding of the challenges and threats in space. We also have this UK-led initiative that is trying to build on normative suasion in space. And I think that those are things that the international community, anybody who's a space stakeholder, needs to get behind. And I will also say that, you know, commercial solutions alone are, of course, very important, but this is also something that is going to likely involve public-private partnerships in trying to put forward both the technical and the normative and policy agenda. So, you know, through what platforms we do that, how we do that, with what objectives in mind, this is something that I think governments need to really take a lead on in partnership with commercial players. So that's what I would put on the table.
Somewhat related to that, we got a question. Let's see, what is the most effective and plausible way that can protect our space activity from malicious persons and or countries who try to, for example, destroy, deceive, and steal our assets in space? Our space seems to be a wild west of sorts. How do you manage that?
Yeah, so I will just put something on the table for us all to consider. I think that what happens in outer space is really rooted very much in the geopolitics on Earth. It's not just a technical issue. I mean, you can have jamming and cyber attacks and terrorism. You can have deliberate, targeting of space assets. But at the end of the day, I think that, what is happening in outer space is not divorced from what is happening around us. So if we have to begin to think about solutions and build solutions, I think that the big players need to sit down and talk. This is where I think that this UK-led initiative is a very important initiative to try to get the big space powers to move towards the direction of establishing these safe practices in space. And this is not a technical solution. This is a political, strategic, and policy issue. So, once we had that, maybe the technical solutions, of course, long and in the making, those can actually follow on as well. So that's what I would put on the table from a sort of a strategic standpoint. I would also say that the threats are not going to go away if we don't sit down and talk. So how do we do that? How we sort of build out these platforms to get everybody to the table to sort of realize the issue. I think that's where we are. Yes, it's an academic problem, but as I said, and as Masami sort of agrees, this is a very practical problem as well. We need to come to something, and soon, as this commercial activity sort of takes off in space, it cannot continue if we get some sort of a disaster in space going forward. That will put a stop to everything, including your GPS. So if you think that's important, then I think that we need to think very carefully about how we build out those policies and structures and normative suasion methods.
We have go ahead, Ishida-san.
Yeah, can I add one comment on the Sadia's comment? So to build such kind of an international framework, I would say the key is a multilateral agreement, I think. Because various countries and companies are stepping into the space sector at an accelerated pace recently, the number of stakeholders is increasing. So that it's becoming more difficult for a global space sector to make international treaty, to build on our outer space treaty since 1969. On the other hand, soft laws such as guidelines sometimes are not effective because it's not legally binding. So under this circumstance, I would say the multilateral agreement will be the mainstream to develop the international framework, especially the space nations with well-developed technology and also with domestic regulation should act harmoniously each other and accumulate the best practice and take a lead in promoting the international framework on policy and best practice.
Great. Ishida-san, I wanted to ask you a question about kind of regulations and policies. And I know you are the head of an organization that's really trying to build up the space business ecosystem in Japan. Are there any specific regulations or policies that you feel like Japan needs to amend, change to help your cause, to help the private sector actors or folks who want to get involved in space to be more active? What are kind of the policy impediments that companies are facing in Japan?
Yeah, thank you for the great question. Yeah, I think from the governmental perspective, an integrated policy about regulation and industrial development will be the key. The excessive restriction may affect negatively free competition. As a result, market entry and private investment will slow down. So the government need to care about how to promote the space activities in the private sector, as well as how to regulate the activity in the private sector. These two elements are different sides of the same coin. So I would say the integrated policy about regulation and industrial development will be the key.
Okay. Mr. Fletcher, do you have thoughts on the U.S. side? Are there specific regulations or policies that you would want to change?
There are actually.
Okay.
Actually, I have a strong belief that because of the global nature of the business, the sector that we're in, that both in Japan and the United States would benefit if we had freer opportunity to work globally, work together. And I think that there should be the means to encourage that. Okay, there are impediments to that. These are not easy to change, of course, but I think in it's sort of the rising tide floating all boats. I think there's a real opportunity when we're able to collaborate and work together internationally, and sometimes we're restricted in doing that. I mentioned that a little bit about how NASA works, and that they're really not able to work very easily with internationals. And I understand there's a good reason for that. They're federally funded by the U.S. taxpayers. But I think that the opportunity, when you look at the big picture and you think about the economic opportunity that's generated from a collaborative relationship, I think that on balance, that you're better off under those circumstances. And I think that it's a benefit for the U.S. and I think it's a benefit for Japan.
Thanks very much. And we have a question about collaboration, specifically about the UAE Space Agency on the Mission to Mars program. Would you all talk about your involvement with that and what that was like?
Do you want me to start off? Yeah, so the mission Hope to Mars, the UAE was, of course, launched from Japan. So to make that happen, especially during a very difficult time, was a challenge for us, and not just the UAE, but various other space programs. We had to work even to get people to go to the launch site, get the tracking stations operational for the launch, things like that. So there were many named people who were behind the scenes working to make this all happen. And of course, the UAE people came to Japan during those times, and they did all the quarantine and everything amazingly to make the launch happen. So I think really it was a symbol of our resilience and perseverance and everything, and hope, as it's named, during the time of COVID and of course, international cooperation.
Great, thank you. And let's see, we have time for maybe one more question. Let's see. Do you think some of the technology used for space navigation can be applied for super speed transportation on Earth? If so, please elaborate. So if anybody wants to tackle that.
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure exactly what the question is getting at. I mean, Saudia mentioned the importance of GPS. I mean, GPS is used for position, navigation, and timing, and it's used, just about everywhere. And that would be a system that would be employed. So
it looks more like the question is about do like space suborbital flights could be adapted to space tourism, sort of.
Okay.
Earth to Earth transportation. I think that's, well, I read that question that way.
Okay, I guess I'm not, I'm not quite, maybe you can answer that one. I'm not quite sure. I'll best address that.
Yes, well, I guess Mike is the aeronautics person, so he should probably have ideas, but yes, no, I hope so, but as probably the person who posted this question knows, each of these companies who are planning suborbital flights actually have that in mind, and have shown us various visuals that will make this happen in all the spaceports and everything. And yeah, so I do hope such a day will come. And Mike, of course, knows that we've been working on these supersonic transportation as well, and how regulation is so difficult to make that happen. So there is a lot to tackle still, not just for the technology, but more of making, for instance, the aircraft use possible in terms of standards and regulations, and at airports around the world and airspaces around the world. So I do hope so. There's a long way. All I can say is let's work towards it.
And one final, I'm gonna ask one final question to Onoda-san to end on an optimistic note. You mentioned that Japan is gonna be recruiting a new generation of astronauts. How is that process gonna play out? Like, how do you apply, or how are you gonna choose new astronauts?
Yeah, so if they're Japanese, you need, I believe you will need a Japanese citizenship, although the call is not out yet, so you have to look at the call. And so first to look out for the call when it comes very soon, and then do not forget to apply. That's the first step. So and we do hope, because we do hope to have international, although from Japanese citizens to apply, and we will make it possible for all of you to apply and to sit through the exams, and to a series of exams, and then to be selected eventually and go to the moon.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone. This was a fascinating discussion, and really thank you for your time. I know Paul wants to give some closing remarks, so I'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Tomoko-san. Thank you to all of our speakers, our attendees, our wonderful partners, Tomoko as the moderator. We really thank you for sharing your expertise on the U.S. Japan alliance and the space economy, which is obviously growing quite a lot in these present times. Thank you as well to everyone who's been part of this program. I know a lot of people have left by now, but thank you for your eagerness to explore this interesting topic. We will also have a post-program survey that will pop up in your browser window once the event ends. So we appreciate sharing your thoughts on this event. This will help us make these programs even better. So this time I'd like to share some details about upcoming events. First of all, for our friends in Alabama, please visit www.japanalabama.com. That's all, Japanalabama, one word, .com, to learn more about the Japan America Society of Alabama and its work. Additionally, the SMU Tower Center, as Hiroki mentioned earlier, will have a program on October 7th at 6:30 p.m. Central. This will be an online event focusing on the East Asian COVID-19 paradox with Dr. Yves Tiberghien from the University of British Columbia. And next, if you just give me a moment, I'm going to share the screen, share a couple events. Okay, let me first mention our friends with the World Affairs Council. So we'll have there'll be a program with Peter McBride talking about photography, and as you can see, these wonderful photos from the Grand Canyon to the world's most quiet places. That will be Thursday, September 23rd at 5:30 p.m. Central. So please go to dfwworld.org to find more information about that program. And then lastly, on Wednesday, October 20th, this will be a hybrid event for the the Japan America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth. It's also in collaboration with the Crow Museum of Asian Art. So for those of you in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you can actually come to this program. We have about 30 spaces to see this program on Hokusai, who's one of the most iconic artists in Japanese history. But also we'll have an online feature. So if you cannot join us, or if you're in the Dallas area and just simply want to stay at home, you will be able to join that program as well. So please go to jasdfw.org to learn more. Well, thank you so much. This does close our program. We appreciate your time, and please have a great rest of the evening for those in the United States, and great morning and great rest of the day for those in Japan. Thank you so much.